compromise the memory structure in the device and take out the password and username. So as it would use Eternal Blue to spread, it would also use Mimikatz to steal credentials and ultimately escalate privileges across the network. Now, within this was ransomware, and I put that in quotes because ransomware, as it's designed to do, is to encrypt a PC or a device, essentially preventing you from getting at your data and then until you have to pay a ransom in order to get the key to decrypt it. Well, in this case, this decryption was not reversible. There was no key. So what we describe this as wiper malware. So you can right away know that the goal of this was not ransom, even though it was masquerading as ransomware. The goal was to create destruction. So as this software was compromised and users went out to download the latest version of the software, it spread like wildfire. It would infect a device. The Eternal Blue component would scan for other vulnerable workstations, compromise them, steal their credentials, rinse and repeat. And this went on and on and on. Now, it just so happens that Maersk, one of the world's largest shipping conglomerates, had an office in Odessa, which is obviously a port city in Ukraine. And with that particular office that they had, just like anybody else, they had to use the MEDOC accounting software in order to interact with the government and do business. So happens that they updated their software as well, which downloaded the backdoor. And that created a foothold that let it spread throughout their entire network. Within 7 minutes, the majority of their devices were compromised. And even worse, ultimately, it was able to compromise and encrypt their domain controllers. The domain controllers are essentially the keystone of any enterprise network. They hold all the user accounts and passwords. If that gets compromised, in this case, encrypted and rendered useless, that means nobody can log into the network. You can't get access to your data. You can't get access to servers. In many cases, you can't even log into your PC. This had the effect of ultimately halting Maersk as a business. All of the software that they depended on for logistics, for unloading containers for ships, figuring out where those containers went, loading them back on ships, permitting trucks in and out of the ports, all of this was compromised because the directory controller, the domain controller, was unusable. Now, when we look back at what was the impact of NotPetya globally, the White House estimates that it cost about $10 billion. 300 million of that, it was obviously Maersk was impacted. That's, in fact, people think they were impacted more, thinking about the time and the cost it took them to get back up and running, which was right around a week's time. But globally, all of the businesses that NotPetya impacted cost us about $10 billion. So that's why I'd like to talk a little bit about today about cybersecurity, give you a better perspective of how these attacks work and how we have to think about cybersecurity, what it is, and risk, how we address that risk, but ultimately for the purpose of making you more cyber smart. Because when we think about cybersecurity, we recognize that of all of the things that cybersecurity depends on, humans, people, are the weakest link. And by educating ourselves, taking simple steps to make ourselves and our organization more secure, we can actually, in many ways, become a human firewall to protect against these threats. One thing I want to point out, as I go through this presentation, you will see an icon in the upper right-hand corner. These refer to NetAcad courses as part of the Skills for All curriculum the content on that particular slide refers to. We'll share this deck after the presentation. You'll be able to get access to it. But the idea is, if you want to learn more about what this slide is talking, go deeper. Here's a course that you can actually follow and take that will help you understand more and will really get you on the journey to developing career-ready skills in cybersecurity. Let me start off with some basics. If somebody were to stop you on the street and ask you, what is cybersecurity? I think a lot of people might say, oh, it's about keeping viruses off your computer, or things like that. But there's actually a definition that we all use that is as simple as it gets. Cybersecurity is about protecting three things: the confidentiality, meaning we want to keep private things private; the integrity, keep things as they are, don't allow them to be altered or changed unless we want them to; and available, that we should be able to access the systems. confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. That is what cybersecurity is. No matter what circumstance you think about, whether we're talking about the cloud or a PC, it's all about doing one of those three things. And the priority of them can change in different contexts, but one of those three things, or all of those three things, in order to safeguard everything we depend on in our digital world. But even though we can talk about cybersecurity in relatively simplistic terms, as we know, things are much more complicated than that. Security really has to be thought of as an interdependent chain of capabilities. In order to realize that confidentiality, integrity, and availability, we have to secure a lot of things that are interdependent. First of all, we need secure products. And what do I mean by secure products? Well, I mean those things that, whether they're PCs, they're a cloud software, or they're instances of applications. Unfortunately, in many cases, because humans are at the center of all these things, there are vulnerabilities that creep into them. People make mistakes when they code software, and sometimes the mistakes are really obvious, sometimes they're not obvious. But products can have vulnerabilities. So we need to make sure that we have secure products. After that, we need to make sure that we implement them securely through secure configurations. It's no good to have a secure product that has no password set or has no access controls on what you can configure or do with the device. So we need to make sure that the device is hardened and locked down, and only the people with the privileges to access it have those privileges. Then they need to be in a secure environment, meaning wherever this software or this instance of IT is running, we need to protect it so that, for example, not anybody can access it across the internet. And then overriding all of this are what we could describe as secure practices. How do we make sure that the processes and procedures and technologies that we use to keep everything secure are being done on a daily basis? We describe this as hygiene, things like updating software regularly, making sure all of the users who have access to things only have the access they need to do their work. All of these things combine in order to build this chain that ultimately we need to take care of in order to be secure. Now, when we think about capabilities, any capability is made up of three things. It's made up of a process, it's made up of a technology, and it's made up of people. A process is about the steps you follow to do something. So it may be, how do I make sure that I configure this operating system with the right settings so that only people with the right privileges access it? Technology is obviously the tool that we have in place to affect that. Having a function such as being able to set passwords, to encrypt communications. And then people who are at the center of all of this, who have to get both of these things right, have to have the right process, have the right technology, and all of that has to be built in the right way in order for things to be secure. But as I say, unfortunately, people are the weakest link. Technology does what we tell it, and the process is only as good as what we put together. But people make mistakes. We're fallible, as I say. When we build software, when we install software, sometimes we don't do the right job. Sometimes we make very obvious mistakes. Sometimes we're not monitoring what's going on inside of our environment. We see that somebody is actually accessing something they shouldn't be. Maybe we've got the wrong architecture, policy, or oversight. There are so many places where people can make mistakes that ultimately leads to an erosion of the foundational cybersecurity that we need to protect things. And there's a simple statistic, excuse me, that bears this out. When we look across all of the types of breaches that go on out there, somebody hacking into a system, somebody stealing credentials, the biggest vector of attack, the largest, is phishing. And phishing is all about people, about sending something, whether it's a text or an email, some message in front of somebody that convinces them that this is legitimate and they should engage with it. They should click on a link. They should open an attachment. They should execute things on the attachment. And all of that comes down to people and the choices that people make. So as we start to think about this, because that's what cybersecurity is, but cybersecurity is more than just these foundational definitional components. It's also about how we think about risk. Ultimately, risk is our evaluation of the probability of an event occurring and the impact that could have on us. And this is important, how we think about risk in cybersecurity, because we can't protect all things everywhere at 100%. There is no 100% security. We have to take the limited resources and the limited capabilities we have and protect what matters most. So how we think about cybersecurity risk is the way that security practitioners ultimately go about their job. There's a definition for cybersecurity risk, and a lot of these are drawn from standards out there. One of the great things about cybersecurity is that there are a lot of standards that give us definitions and guidance and frameworks for how we approach this challenge. Ultimately, the problem is that people don't do necessarily a good job of following it. But cyber risk is how we think about the ultimate harm that could come to an organization based on the threat that's out there, what could possibly try to come after us, the vulnerabilities, what weaknesses would they exploit, and then what impact that could have for us. Now, there's another concept I want to introduce before we talk more about cyber risk that is foundational to how we think about cybersecurity, because cyber risk or cyber attacks are not atomic incidences. They don't just happen. Like the dependency chain of cyber capabilities, there's a dependency chain of cyber attacks. Whatever the attack is, you can say it's somebody going after a user's credentials, hacking into their device on a Starbucks network, trying to bring down a large company, whatever it is, there are a common set of activities that occur that can guide us about how we think about risk and protecting ourselves. So this, known as the cyber chain, is a model that goes back many years, developed originally by Lockheed Martin, and it characterizes the way attacks in one shape or form or other unfold. The first is what we call reconnaissance.